The desert wind carried a thick haze of sand and diesel exhaust across the Kuwaiti horizon. It was the early hours of February 26, 1991. The U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, Task Force 22, had just crested a ridge west of a nondescript point on the map known as 73 Easting. Below them stretched an armored host, Soviet-made T-52s, BMPs, and BTRs, arrayed in scattered columns, some dug into the sand, others repositioning for a fight they didn't expect to lose. This was not a drill. Radio chatter spiked. Enemy confirmed. Targets: multiple. Distance: 2,800 meters. But the order didn't come from an Abrams tank. It came from a 25-ton fighting vehicle with a 25mm chain gun and 2 rectangular launch tubes mounted on its side. The M2 Bradley had spotted first. And it fired first. What followed in the next 20 minutes would devastate an entire Iraqi armored brigade and dismantle decades of Soviet mechanized theory in the process. As the lead Bradley acquired targets using thermal sights, it launched 2 TOW missiles in rapid succession. Both struck true. A T-72 erupted in a fireball, its turret launched skyward. A second T-55 exploded mid-turn, its crew never seeing what hit them. Across the formation, other Bradleys joined in, firing at maximum range, coordinating in fire teams, clearing paths for advancing Abrams tanks still out of sight. But by the time the M1s arrived, the killing was already underway. In 23 minutes, Bradleys had destroyed or disabled dozens of armored vehicles, BMPs, T-55s, reconnaissance units, all without a single confirmed loss. To the untrained eye, this looked like tactical brilliance. To Soviet strategists watching from afar, it looked impossible. The M2 Bradley had been categorized as an inferior platform. Lightly armored, vulnerable to autocannons, only useful as a transport. But in this desert battlefield, it was moving with speed, striking with precision, and evaporating units designed to fight NATO's best tanks. From the high ridgeline, U.S. mechanized infantry gunners watched flaming Soviet armor detonate in sequence. BMPs turned to molten wrecks. Turrets smoked. Gunners fled on foot. And the Bradleys didn't advance. They hunted. That day at 73 Easting was more than a battle. It was a funeral for the Soviet model of motorized warfare. And the M2 Bradley, dismissed, overlooked, underestimated, was the one driving the coffin nails in. In 1980, deep inside the Soviet General Staff's War Planning Center near Frunzenskaya Embankment, a red folder was circulated among armored warfare analysts. Inside, technical specs, NATO doctrine forecasts, and a profile of a new American vehicle, the M2 Bradley. The summary read, "A lightly armored infantry transporter, limited survivability, not intended for tank engagement." The folder was filed under secondary threats, and with that, the Soviets sealed their fate. From that moment forward, every war game, every simulation, and every defensive blueprint built by the Warsaw Pact ignored one critical reality. The Bradley wasn't built to support tanks. It was built to kill them. But Soviet assumptions weren't baseless. They were based on what the M2 looked like on paper, and what it wasn't. It wasn't a main battle tank. It didn't carry a 105mm or 125mm cannon. Its armor was thin compared to the T-72. Its speed was average. And its silhouette? Boxy. tall, vulnerable. To Soviet war planners who worshipped mass, steel, and barrel length, the M2 was a footnote. But they missed the data they didn't have access to, data buried inside DARPA test ranges and U.S. Army training centers. They missed what the M2 could do before it was ever seen: detect, range, lock, and destroy. While Soviet BMP crews relied on line-of-sight and outdated optics, the M2 had thermal imaging. While T-55s fired at 1,800 meters, Bradleys launched Tobusua missiles at 3,750 meters. And while Soviet APCs offloaded infantry for the assault, U.S. Bradleys did something else entirely. They cleared the battlefield first. This was a generational shift in doctrine. To the Soviets, motorized divisions were about overwhelming numbers, stacked lines of armored personnel carriers and tanks moving in synchronized waves. But U.S. planners, hardened by the nightmares of World War II's hedgerows and Korea's hills, were crafting something far deadlier: a system of lethal autonomy, small, fast, overgunned units that could act as their own hammer, their own shield. And at the center of that vision was the M2 Bradley. The Pentagon's brass knew that the Soviets believed in quantity over quality, so they didn't try to outnumber them. They built something that could outthink them, outrange them, outgun them. And in 1991, on an empty stretch of Kuwaiti desert, all those assumptions, years of Soviet doctrine, would be turned to ash by one decision made long ago: to underestimate the Bradley. For over 3 decades, the Soviet motorized doctrine had dominated Eastern war planning. From Berlin to Baku, one principle held steady: massed armor wins wars. It was a philosophy born in the chaos of World War II, refined in the steppes of Kursk, codified in Hungary, and exported across the Warsaw Pact. Layered motor rifle divisions, regiment after regiment of BMPs and T-55s, backed by artillery and mechanized logistics. It was elegant in its brutality. And it relied on one assumption: that NATO would never have the stomach to meet it head-on. But in the late 1970s, as U.S. commanders ran war games simulating a Soviet invasion of West Germany, a grim pattern emerged. Even with superior tanks like the M60 or Abrams in play, U.S. forces were consistently overwhelmed, not by quality, but by the sheer volume of Warsaw Pact steel. The solution wasn't more tanks. It was a new breed of infantry vehicle, one that could do more than carry troops. So the U.S. built the M2 Bradley, not to protect infantry behind armor, but to move them into the kill zone and then clear it. This shift shattered the classical NATO doctrine of armor first, infantry follow. Instead, the Bradley was trained to operate alongside Abrams tanks, not behind them. In combined arms exercises like Reforger and NTC rotations, U.S. doctrine rewrote the rules. Bradleys would screen ahead of the line. Bradleys would deliver flanking fire against enemy armor. Bradleys would conduct night operations independent of tanks. And most importantly, Bradleys would kill tanks. This was unheard of. Soviet BTRs and BMPs were designed to avoid tank engagements, not initiate them. But U.S. planners, influenced by lessons from Israeli armored tactics and Vietnam's jungle logistics, realized something the Soviets hadn't. The future of mechanized war would be decided by sensors, speed, and surgical firepower, not sheer numbers. The Bradley, with its FLIR optics and TOW missiles, could strike targets long before BMPs or T-55s could fire back. Its turret-mounted Bushmaster 25mm cannon could perforate light armor and suppress enemy infantry at 2,000 meters. It could deploy its own squad and support them with cannon fire simultaneously. The Soviets weren't ready for that. Their doctrine expected APCs to dismount under fire, rely on tank cover, and hope the mass wave would break the line. But the Americans weren't waiting in lines anymore. They were coming over hills, through fog, at night, with lock-on range beyond Soviet vision. And when that doctrine clash finally arrived in the burning deserts of Iraq, only one side's playbook survived. February 26, 1991. Southern Iraq, near grid line 73 easting. A dust storm was sweeping across the desert, turning the landscape into a pale blur. Through it, a column of U.S. Bradleys and Abrams tanks pushed eastward, Task Force 22, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. What they saw on their thermal sights would become the stuff of legend. In the distance, a full Iraqi mechanized brigade, dug in and armed with Soviet-designed BMP-1s, BMP-2s, and T-72s, arranged in classic Soviet depth formations, textbook armor doctrine. To anyone watching through standard optics, they were ghosts in the sand. But not to the Bradley. Using its FLIR thermal sights, the lead M2 picked up the heat signatures of armored vehicles at over 3,000 meters, well beyond BMP or T-55 visual range, and without waiting for the Abrams to open fire, the Bradley engaged. Tow missiles out. 20 seconds. 2 impacts. 2 BMPs exploded in fireballs, scattering debris and crews across the desert floor. Within minutes, the rest of the Bradleys joined in, firing TOWs, ripping off bursts from their 25mm Bushmaster cannons, and flooding the enemy's first echelon with precision fire. Soviet doctrine assumed such vehicles would retreat or wait for tank support. Instead, the Bradleys charged forward, not recklessly, but tactically, using terrain and overwatch, bounding from ridge to ridge, picking targets, executing kill chains with chilling efficiency. What made it worse for the enemy? They never saw it coming. Their thermal optics were primitive or non-existent. Their gunners relied on periscopes or daylight scopes, useless in the dust. By the time return fire was coordinated, over 30 armored vehicles had been destroyed or disabled. One Iraqi BMP attempted to flank from a low depression. A Bradley gunner spotted it, adjusted his elevation, and fired a high-explosive round into the track area. The vehicle flipped, burned, and never made radio contact again. Total engagement time, 23 minutes. Enemy armored formation, obliterated. U.S. losses, 0. It was the first major mechanized engagement where Bradleys, not tanks, led the assault. Soviet military observers, many of whom had trained their allies in BMP usage, were stunned when the footage emerged. They watched, in disbelief, as a scout vehicle outranged, outsaw, and outshot frontline Soviet armor. One report, leaked months later, summarized the encounter in 4 words. Our doctrine failed completely. The M2 Bradley wasn't designed to be a tank. But that morning, it fought like one, faster, smarter, and deadlier than anything the Soviets had ever prepared for. Back in Moscow, the initial reports from the Gulf War were treated with heavy skepticism. Iraqi units, after all, had Soviet equipment, but not Soviet training. And for the General Staff, that distinction mattered. When the first intercepted intelligence briefings reached Soviet military analysts, the numbers were dismissed outright. Bradleys? Leading the assault? Bradleys? Outgunning tanks? The figures were disturbing. More than 1,600 enemy armored vehicles destroyed by U.S. forces in days, a significant portion credited to mechanized infantry, not tanks. TOW missiles with a 100% kill rate when launched from M2s in overwatch positions, but the analysts refused to accept it. At a closed-door GRU review, a senior officer scoffed, "A lightly armored vehicle with no composite plating cannot be a tank killer." The denial ran deep. For decades, Soviet tank doctrine was built around armor parity. They believed only a tank could kill a tank. Infantry fighting vehicles were support, nothing more. So the idea that the M2 Bradley, lighter, cheaper, and smaller, had hunted Soviet-designed T-55s and BMPs was offensive to the entire system. They blamed terrain. They blamed Iraqi incompetence. They blamed American propaganda. But then the footage arrived. Overhead drone videos, leaked to global media, showed M2 Bradleys cresting dunes, locking targets, and firing TOWs into armor columns from over 2 miles away. One clip, studied frame by Soviet engineers, showed an M2 halting, launching a TOW, killing a T-72, and repositioning before the enemy fired a single shot. Another clip showed a BMP attempting to retreat, only to be shredded by a 25mm burst through its side hull, where its fuel cells were located. Suddenly, the argument shifted. Soviet commanders began asking, "What did we miss?" The answer was chilling. They had missed the M2's thermal sighting capability, which turned night into day. They had underestimated the standoff range of U.S. infantry fighting vehicles. They had no answer for the combined arms agility of mechanized U.S. units. But perhaps the most damaging realization came from field interviews with captured Iraqi officers. One of them stated, "We never feared the tanks. It was the Bradleys. They came first, and we never saw them coming." For Moscow, this wasn't just a tactical failure. It was a strategic embarrassment. The vehicle they never respected had shattered their export reputation. The battlefield they assumed would expose Western weakness had revealed Soviet fragility. By the time real combat data reached the General Staff, it was too late to adapt. The M2 Bradley had already rewritten the rules of mechanized war, and Moscow had to face a truth more painful than defeat. They hadn't just underestimated a machine. They had underestimated an entire philosophy of warfare. Soviet planners clung to one central truth: armor beats armor. That principle, rooted in the victories of the Great Patriotic War, had shaped every generation of Soviet vehicle development since 1945. Tanks were designed to spearhead breakthroughs. IFVs and APCs followed behind, ferrying troops to consolidate gains. Anti-tank roles were assigned to artillery or aircraft, not infantry vehicles. And so when the M2 Bradley entered service in the 1980s, Soviet analysts filed it neatly into their existing framework. They called it a modernized troop transport. They judged its 25mm cannon too weak for tank engagements. They viewed its TOW launcher as a secondary weapon, useful only in defensive ambushes. None of this was true. In fact, the M2's primary design wasn't to transport troops. It was to dominate the flanks of the battlefield, neutralize light armor, and suppress tank columns before they could reach firing distance. But Soviet theory never accounted for range asymmetry. Their BMP-1's 73mm gun was accurate only up to 500–600 meters. Its AT-3 Sagar missile required line of sight and manual control, making it useless in poor visibility or under fire. Meanwhile, the M2 Bradley's TOW system fired semi-automatically guided missiles at nearly 4 kilometers, with pinpoint accuracy, even through smoke or dust. The mismatch was catastrophic. In battle simulations at Fort Irwin, U.S. Bradleys repeatedly destroyed Soviet-based mock units before they ever entered their own weapons engagement envelope. And this wasn't theory. In Desert Storm, these simulations became real. Bradley units moved in hunter-killer teams, one vehicle scanning with thermals, another firing from covered overwatch. The moment a BMP appeared in the open, a TOW would streak across the battlefield and annihilate it, often with the crew never even detecting the Bradley. One recorded kill from the 3rd Armored Division showed a Bradley taking out 3 BMPs and a T-55 in under 6 minutes, without moving from its original firing position. Soviet theory had no response to this. Their doctrine required visual confirmation, coordinated mass movement, and pre-planned artillery grids. But the Bradley shattered that rhythm. It didn't wait. It didn't mass. It struck first, and from beyond return fire range. By the time the Soviet-aligned Iraqi units tried to counter, their formations were in disarray, their armor disabled, and their doctrine in flames. What the Soviets believed would be a support vehicle had revealed the blind spot in their entire system. The wrong theory wasn't just tactical, it was cultural. A refusal to believe that a smaller, faster, networked machine could outfight traditional steel. But on the battlefield, the Bradley didn't ask for permission. It just killed what it saw. The second Soviet miscalculation ran even deeper, because it wasn't about weapons or vehicles. It was about the men inside them. Soviet doctrine trained its mechanized infantry for obedience. They were expected to follow precise movement patterns, dismount only when ordered, and wait for supporting fire before advancing. It was a system built for control, not creativity. By contrast, U.S. Bradley crews were trained to make decisions on the move, to act autonomously, and to lead engagements, not follow them. This difference became lethal in the open desert. In early February 1991, during a skirmish west of the Rumaila oil fields, a U.S. mechanized unit using M2 Bradleys encountered a company-sized force of Iraqi BMP-1s and dismounted infantry. The Iraqi unit attempted a textbook Soviet maneuver, rapid flank and assault under artillery cover. But the Bradley crews didn't wait. They spotted the maneuver forming on thermals and immediately executed a bounding overwatch counterattack. One section advanced, while another covered. They fired TOWs from hull-down positions and used 25mm airburst rounds to suppress the infantry. Before the Iraqi force could even deploy from their APCs, they'd lost 60% of their fighting strength. That battle lasted 11 minutes. No Abrams, no air cover, just Bradleys. Acting alone. This was what Soviet planners had never anticipated: mechanized infantry leading the fight. In their minds, infantry were passengers, carried into battle, deployed, then protected by tanks. But in the U.S. Army of 1991, Bradleys were doing something revolutionary. Detecting enemy armor before tanks did. Striking with precision at long range. Supporting their own dismounts with suppressive fire. Operating without constant command and control input. Soviet theory depended on rigid coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. U.S. mechanized doctrine trusted small units to adapt, flank, and strike with minimal oversight. That agility proved fatal to Soviet-style formations. When Soviet-aligned units attempted combined arms attacks, they were too slow, too linear. By the time they arrived, the Bradleys had already repositioned, reloaded, and eliminated their support elements. In one encounter, a U.S. mechanized platoon feigned a retreat through a shallow wadi, baiting enemy armor into a kill zone. Within 2 minutes, 4 BMPs were destroyed by TOWs fired from concealment. No tanks, just coordinated Bradley gunners, reading terrain and rewriting doctrine on the fly. The Soviet model had no answer for this kind of thinking. Their second great mistake was assuming that NATO infantry was cautious, reactive, tethered to tank formations. But the Bradley shattered that idea. It was fast, it was aware, and it gave its crew the power to decide. In a war where seconds meant survival, that decision-making edge was everything. The Soviets hadn't just misjudged the vehicle. They'd misjudged the will and training of the men who drove it. And once the battle began, there was no time left to learn. For years, Soviet military intelligence had watched the U.S. rearm its ground forces. They saw the emergence of the Abrams tank, the Apache helicopter, and the Patriot missile system as legitimate threats. But the M2 Bradley? That was considered a technical afterthought. KGB analysts, using satellite imagery, trade show data, and arms catalog intercepts, classified the Bradley as a medium mobility personnel vehicle with limited combat value. Internal reports described it as vulnerable to autocannon fire, dependent on external support, and unsuitable for frontline armored engagements. This analysis shaped how Soviet war planners prepared their countermeasures. In simulations run by the Soviet General Staff in 1986 and 1988, the Bradley was programmed to follow tanks, dismount infantry, and avoid direct combat with enemy armor. The simulations never tested for what happened if the Bradley led. The intelligence failure wasn't just one of performance, it was one of intent. Soviet intelligence had no idea that U.S. mechanized doctrine had evolved past rigid roles. They didn't know that the Bradley was being trained for independent deep strike missions, hunter-killer teams with drones and Apaches, autonomous maneuver warfare in degraded command environments, and most critically, they failed to understand the technological overmatch baked into the M2. Its suite of sensors, FLIR, laser rangefinders, GPS integration, was a generation ahead of the BMPs it was designed to kill. At night, the Bradley saw everything. At range, it could engage anything. And in fog, dust, or rain, it still operated with deadly clarity. Soviet BMPs, by comparison, were blind in darkness and vulnerable in motion. In one U.S. after-action report from Desert Storm, a Bradley crew describes destroying 4 BMPs in under 5 minutes, using thermal imagery to identify targets hidden in camouflage. Another engagement in the Hammer Marshes showed a pair of Bradleys using satellite-guided movement to flank and ambush a mixed Iraqi column, without firing a single tank round. When the CIA shared classified combat footage with Allied analysts in 1992, NATO briefers watched Soviet officers in East Berlin quietly take notes, then put their pens down in silence. What they saw, on screen in infrared, was the total failure of Soviet counterintelligence. Their forces had gone to war with doctrine built on the wrong questions. How thick is the armor? What caliber is the main gun? How fast does it drive? They should have asked, how far can it see? How quickly can it shoot? How smart is its crew? By the time those questions were being asked, over 1,500 enemy vehicles had been destroyed. A majority, not by Abrams, not by Apaches, but by Bradleys. The machine the Soviets dismissed had become the very thing that exposed their greatest weakness. They had prepared for tanks. They were killed by tactics. The M2 Bradley was never designed to fight alone, and that's precisely why it was so lethal. It didn't just kill tanks. It killed entire formations by being part of something bigger. A networked machine of war the Soviets didn't believe was real. In 1991, that system was fully unleashed across the Iraqi desert. At the center was the Bradley, nimble, sharp-eyed, and heavily armed. But surrounding it were layers of support the Soviet Union had no equivalent for. M1A1 Abrams tanks, moving in sync with Bradleys, using secure radios and Blue Force tracking to coordinate overlapping fields of fire. AH-64 Apache helicopters, operating in tandem with mechanized infantry, following real-time Bradley target designations, J-STARS and AWACS, overhead command aircraft mapping enemy movement and feeding coordinates down to frontline Bradley units. Artillery with GPS-guided shells, smashing hardened bunkers called in by Bradley forward observers using digital fire control networks. And perhaps most importantly, U.S. air superiority, with F-15s and F-117s eliminating enemy SAM sites before the Bradleys ever rolled out. It was not a fighting force. It was a kill web. While Soviet BMPs had to wait for centralized commands, the Bradleys had battlefield autonomy. Squad leaders could make real-time decisions. Platoons could engage without higher authorization. They weren't just faster in movement, they were faster in thought. In one infamous case outside Basra, a combined U.S. mechanized company used M2 Bradleys to pin down an Iraqi armor column, relay coordinates to artillery 15 kilometers away, shift flanking fire to suppress ATGM teams, and direct Apaches to strike retreating armor, all within 11 minutes. Every part of that kill chain began with a Bradley gunner scanning thermals. The Soviets had no counter for this. Their units required radio verification for artillery missions. Their tanks lacked GPS synchronization. Their IFVs couldn't share sensor data in real time. U.S. forces were using digital maps and real-time Blue Force tracking as early as 1990. A Bradley commander could look at his screen and see friendly units, live mission updates, and target markers, all while scanning for enemy heat signatures. This system was born from hard lessons: Vietnam's fragmentation, Cold War paranoia, and years of joint force experimentation. And it worked. In Desert Storm, M2 Bradleys operated at tempo levels never seen in warfare. They conducted overwatch and assault in the same maneuver, long-range recon using thermal and digital sensors, coordinated flanking attacks with drones and fast movers, night operations with nearly zero loss of situational awareness. While the Soviets imagined a war of deep operations and tank columns, the Americans had already moved on. They built a system where information was the first weapon, and every vehicle, especially the Bradley, was both a shooter and a sensor. It wasn't just about being lethal. It was about being first. First to see. First to shoot. First to decide. The Bradley was the tip of that digital spear. Not the most armored, not the fastest, not the biggest, but in a battlefield where knowledge moved faster than steel, it was the one that hit hardest. And it proved, once and for all, that war wasn't about what you built. It was about how you connected it all together. March 2nd, 1991. Near Highway 8, just west of Basra. What was supposed to be a last stand turned into a rout. Elements of Iraq's Republican Guard Tawakkalna division, equipped with Soviet T-55s, BMP-1s, and anti-tank teams, dug into defensive positions across a 20-kilometer stretch of desert. They were advised by Soviet-trained officers. They used Soviet doctrine, and they believed, right up to the final hour, that the approaching U.S. mechanized force could be repelled. Then came the 24th Infantry Division, led not by tanks, but by M2 Bradleys. It was the culmination of everything the Soviets said couldn't happen. The Bradleys swept into the area in echelon formation, dismounting scouts to identify positions and firing TOJUs before enemy armor could respond. One Iraqi T-55 attempted to reverse from cover. A Bradley spotted it, fired a TOU from 3,200 meters, and destroyed it before the tank's turret could rotate. On the right flank, a Bradley platoon engaged dug-in BMPs using bounding overwatch, firing 25mm high explosive rounds into exposed side armor, shredding the vehicles in bursts of 5. By the time Abrams tanks arrived, the battlefield was already ablaze. Thermal sights from M1s recorded burning silhouettes, wrecks that had once been armored vehicles, now reduced to smoldering frames by Bradley fire. What made this battle historic wasn't just the result. It was the optics. Lightly armored Bradleys leading the charge, enemy tanks routed by infantry vehicles, Soviet doctrine decimated by American flexibility. Captured Iraqi commanders were interrogated. One confessed, "We didn't expect them to attack so quickly. We never even saw their tanks." Another admitted, "We fired everything at the small ones first, then the big ones came later, but it was too late." That phrase, "the small ones," would become infamous inside U.S. war colleges. It revealed just how deeply the Soviets had underestimated the M2 Bradley, not just in capability, but in concept. Because by the end of that engagement, the small ones had led the charge, coordinated joint fires, destroyed enemy armor, secured the terrain, and suffered minimal casualties. More than 70 enemy vehicles were destroyed in under an hour, half of them by Bradleys. And when the Soviets later analyzed satellite photos of the engagement, what they saw chilled them. There were no tank formations in front. The entire vanguard had been led by IFVs, acting as the new armored spearhead. This battle crushed the final illusions of Soviet mechanized dominance. The myth of heavy beats light had collapsed. And as the smoke settled on that desert highway, one truth was inescapable. The M2 Bradley wasn't just a support vehicle. It was the storm. When the final reports of Operation Desert Storm reached Moscow, the Soviet General Staff could no longer hide behind misinterpretations or excuses. The reality was now undeniable. Their entire Cold War-era theory of mechanized warfare had been obliterated by a vehicle they had dismissed as a glorified bus. The M2 Bradley hadn't just exceeded expectations, it had exposed the fundamental flaws of the Soviet approach to modern war. In internal memos circulated through the Defense Ministry, senior strategists tried to salvage credibility. Iraq lacked Soviet discipline. Training shortfalls contributed to collapse. The Americans relied on unfair technological advantage. But these explanations rang hollow, because deep down, everyone in those rooms understood the truth. The doctrine had failed. Every principle that Soviet war theory rested on was now in ruins, that massed formations would overwhelm digital coordination, that lightly armored vehicles couldn't survive frontline exposure, that combined arms attacks required centralized, scripted movements, that tanks were the first, last, and only tool for breaking enemy lines, all wrong. The U.S. had built a mechanized force that was not only faster and more flexible, but smarter. Its frontline IFVs could act independently, scout, strike, and suppress, without waiting for armor to break the line first. The M2 Bradley had revealed that the battlefield had changed. No longer was it about depth and echelon. It was about speed, sensors, and networked lethality. Soviet command centers scrambled to update their projections. They tried to draft counter-doctrines, but it was too late. The collapse of the USSR began months later, but the intellectual collapse of its military doctrine happened in the sand. And while the world watched the fall of the Berlin Wall and the signing of dissolution papers, one of the quietest and most devastating defeats had already played out. Not in a capital, not in a revolution, but in a battlefield where dozens of Soviet-designed vehicles were reduced to wrecks by a vehicle they hadn't even bothered to fear. In that moment, the Soviet system learned a bitter lesson. It wasn't the tank that ruled the battlefield. It was the information. And the vehicle that carried it best, the M2 Bradley, had proven that the age of steel alone was over. Today, the M2 Bradley still rumbles across dusty training ranges and urban warfare mock-ups. It's seen upgrades, sensor suites, and new digital overlays. But beneath the armor and electronics, it's still the same war machine that changed everything in 1991. It never looked like a revolution. No swept-back wings, no titanium armor, no firepower headline. But in the crucible of modern warfare, it became one. Because the Bradley wasn't just a weapon. It was the first glimpse of a new kind of war. A war where decisions are made in seconds, not by generals in bunkers, but by platoon leaders with thermals and a TOW launcher. Soviet planners never saw that future. They saw metal. They saw calibers. They saw mass. They didn't see a 25mm cannon guiding a formation. They didn't see a sensor blinding a tank crew. They didn't see an IFV outrunning an entire doctrine. But history did. And now, 3 decades later, modern militaries still study 73 Easting, still dissect the M2's kill chains, still marvel at how a vehicle designed for transport became one of the most effective tank killers of its era. The Cold War may have ended without a final clash between superpowers. But in that desert, in those short, explosive minutes of precision chaos, something very real collapsed. Not just a military model, not just an enemy formation, but a way of thinking. And the Bradley didn't just survive it, it defined it. Because in the end, war doesn't care what your manuals say. It only listens to the one who sees first, strikes first, and leaves nothing standing.